Hello viewers, welcome to Kids Auto and Truck Repair. Today we have a 2011 Mercedes E350. The customer complaint on this vehicle is the battery light remains on the dash while the engine is running. The customer called me and told me that when he was driving down the road, he noticed that the battery light came on the dash. And then the check engine light came on, the ABS light came on, and then there were other lights that came on the dash. And right after that, the engine shut down. So he turned the key off, he started the engine again, the engine started back up, but when he kept driving, the battery light remained on the dash. And after that, the engine died for the second time. After the second time, he couldn't start the car. So he towed it to the shop, and now here we are. So the first thing we're gonna do is we are going to confirm the customer's complaint. Let's see if this car is gonna start. If it doesn't start, we're gonna put a battery charger on the battery to start it. Based on what the customer told me, it sounds like the charging system is not working, because he told me the battery light came on first. And then I asked him when was the last time he changed the battery. He told me that the battery was changed about 2 years ago. So we are going to confirm the customer's complaint, and then we're gonna figure out how we can fix this Mercedes. And then I want to mention that it's very hot over here. We have a couple fans going on in the shop, so I'm sorry for the noise that you're gonna hear in the background. And then there are a couple people here in the shop, so it's gonna be a little bit noisy. So I apologize in advance, and I apologize for these fans that are keeping us cool here. So we don't have AC in the shop. It's very hot. We got fans going, so the noise you're gonna hear in the background will be the fans, and I hope you can hear me okay. So now let's confirm the customer's complaint. Let's start the engine. So the engine started, that's good. Now let's observe this display over here. Now I had to put a battery charger on the battery to drive the vehicle in the shop. So the battery is probably a little bit charged right now, but let's watch this. Eventually the battery light is gonna come on. This car is gonna turn me into a liar here. So let's see. Because this vehicle was dropped off by a tow truck outside. So right there, as you can see, the battery light came on. So the customer said that this light came on first, and then there were a bunch of lights that came on the dash. So as you can see, the battery light remains on while the engine is running. So customer's complaint confirmed. I'm gonna turn off the engine so we don't have to drain the battery pretty fast. So now, what do? How do we fix this? We can go a couple ways about this. We can connect a scan tool to the vehicle to see what kind of trouble codes we have in the engine computer, or we can go under the hood and test the charging system. We can test the alternator, and we can do a voltage drop test on the alternator wiring. Now, I know if we connect a scan tool to the vehicle right now, we're gonna have some low voltage codes in the engine computer because this engine died eventually. So what I'm gonna do is I'm not gonna connect the scan tool to the vehicle. I'm gonna go straight under the hood. Let's do a voltage drop test on the alternator. Let's check the alternator wiring. If the alternator wiring is good and the alternator is also good, the charging system on this vehicle while the engine is running should be putting out 13.5 or 14.5 volts. So now let's go under the hood so we can test the charging system. We're gonna do a voltage drop test on the ground side of the alternator and a voltage drop test on the positive side of the alternator. And then we're gonna check the two wires that go to the back of the alternator, because the alternator has an electrical connector on the back of it that has two wires on it. So let's go under the hood. Actually, before we go under the hood, let's look up the wiring diagram of the charging system of this vehicle, and then we're gonna go under the hood and do some tests. Here is the charging system of the Mercedes E350 that we're working on. This vehicle has a 3.5 liter engine. This is the alternator, and this over here is the starter. So there is a red cable that goes from the starter to the B positive terminal of the alternator. So this cable over here, let me highlight it. This cable over here, this red cable, this cable provides constant power to the alternator. And then we have two more wires at the alternator. One wire, this wire over here that I just highlighted, this wire goes to the engine computer, and it's a lean bus wire. So the computer controls the alternator through this wire. And then there is another wire that comes from a fuse, this one, okay? So basically, based on this wiring diagram, this alternator has two wires that supply power to it, and then there is a third wire that comes from the engine computer, which is a lean bus wire, and I believe we're going to have some type of pulse width modulated control on this wire. So if I bring you closer to the wiring diagram, as you can see, this is the alternator, this is the engine computer, and then this is a fuse that supplies power down this wire. Okay, so we should have power at these two wires and then control on this third wire. And the wire that comes from the computer is a black wire. So this is a black wire, and the wire that comes from this fuse over here, fuse 150, in the front pre-fuse right rear of engine compartment. So this fuse over here is in the engine compartment, and this is fuse 150. It's a 400 amp fuse. So if we don't have power on this wire, the issue could be the fuse. Okay, so this is our charging system. Pretty straightforward, pretty simple. So now let's go under the hood so we can do some tests at the alternator. We are here under the hood. The alternator is down over here. The alternator is over there. So we're gonna remove the engine cover. So this cover just pops off. Okay, we're just gonna put it over here, and then we're gonna remove this air duct. We can just pry this back just like that. As you can see, the alternator belt looks good. Okay, so the issue is not the belt is tensioned. Everything looks fine. Now we have to get to the back of the alternator. I don't know if you guys will see back there. Let me see if I can put the light over here so you can see back there. So it looks like you can't really see. So I'm gonna remove this bolt so we can lay this cable back out of the way. So this cable over here, this cable supplies power to the alternator. So this is the red cable that we saw on the wiring diagram. So if we follow this cable, it comes over here and comes to this junction over here. So this is the power supply cable. If I open this, let me get a screwdriver. So let's open this. So as you can see, we have a nut over here, so we can undo this nut and disconnect this cable from the alternator down over here. I'm gonna do that because we either have to disconnect this cable so we don't have power at the alternator. If the issue ends up being the alternator, if we have to remove it, I would prefer to disconnect this cable at this point instead of disconnecting the battery, because if I disconnect the battery, it's gonna reset the time in the car and we're gonna have to set up some stuff. So I'm not gonna disconnect the battery. If the issue ends up being the alternator, I would prefer to disconnect it from this point, okay? But we're gonna do our test down here at the alternator, okay? We're gonna do our test down there. So now I'm gonna remove this bracket so we can lay this cable out of the way. So now we're gonna remove this bolt over here. All right, so now we can lay this cable out of the way. So if you look back here behind the alternator, this cable goes to the back of the alternator. Let me zoom you guys in so you can better see what I'm pointing at. So let's see, let me bring the light down here. It's a little bit difficult to see back here, but this is the back of the alternator. This over here is the electrical connector that has the two wires that we saw on the wiring diagram. So one wire will be coming from the engine computer, and then the other wire will be coming from the fuse. And then this little plastic piece that you see that's sticking over here, this piece is the B positive terminal of the alternator, and this cable is connected to it. So we should have power constantly at this pin. Okay, so I'm gonna back probe these two wires at this electrical connector. Let me disconnect this. Let me see if I can do it while I'm holding the camera. So I don't know if you can see there. So right there, I disconnected the wire that goes on the back of the alternator. So here it is. Let's see. So the wiring diagram showed two wires at this connector, but this connector only has one wire. Okay, so I'm gonna back probe this wire. We're gonna use our scope to watch the control that we have on this wire, and then we are going to test the B positive terminal of the alternator over there. Okay, so I'm gonna get this wire back probed. I'm gonna connect a alligator clamp to this pin over here, the B positive terminal pin at the alternator, and then I'll bring you guys back up. So I'm gonna do all the connections off camera, and then I'll bring you guys back up. So there is just one wire on this connector. Okay, so I'm gonna bring out my lab scope and my multimeter. I'm gonna get everything set up, and then I'll bring you guys back up. Here is what I did off camera. I connected my yellow test lead to the lean bus wire on the electrical connector of the alternator, and then my red test lead is connected to the back of the alternator on the B positive terminal of the alternator. Okay, so I hope you can see. So my alligator clamp is on the B positive terminal of the alternator, and then this yellow test lead is connected to a back probing tool, which is back probing the lean bus wire on the alternator. Okay, so that's good. Now I have a multimeter over here. My red test lead is coming from the B positive terminal of the alternator, and then my black lead is not connected yet. This lead over here is the lead of the lab scope. So if I connect my black test lead that's on the multimeter, so this is connected to the multimeter. As you can see, the multimeter is showing us 0.00. So now I'm going to connect this alligator clamp to ground. If there's power at this red test lead, which is connected to the B positive terminal of the alternator, if there's power here, we should read system voltage after I connect this to ground. So watch this. So I connect this to ground. We are reading 12.60 volts. So that's good. Now I'm gonna go ahead and set up our lab scope. Let's go to scope multimeter. Four channel lab scope. We're just gonna have one channel on the dash. So as you can see, we have system voltage on this wire, which is good. The fact that we have system voltage on this wire with the key off, engine off, tells me that this wire is not shorted or not open. Okay, so the yellow test lead once again is connected to the one wire that's on the alternator electrical connector. And as you can see, we have about system voltage on this wire. Okay, so now the first thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna do a voltage drop test on the positive side of the alternator. So I'm gonna remove this battery cover so we can get access to the battery. Actually, instead of removing the battery cover, we can just leave the battery in. We can just do our voltage drop test over here. Ideally, it's better to do it at the battery. Okay, I'll remove this in case some of you have a question. I'm gonna remove the battery cover so we can do the test at the battery positive terminal. So we're gonna do our test over here at the battery. It's always better to do it at the battery. Okay, so if I disconnect this, our multimeter shows 0 volts. If I connect this to battery terminal, battery ground, we have 12.60. So now I'm gonna connect this to battery positive. Okay, so basically we're going from positive to positive, and that should test the voltage drop test on the positive side of the alternator. So I have one test lead on the multimeter connected to the B positive terminal of the alternator, and then the other test lead on the multimeter connected to the positive post on the battery. Okay, and then our lab scope is connected to the one wire on the electrical connector of the alternator. So now I'm gonna go in the vehicle so we can start the engine. Let's start the engine and see what we got. So as you can hear, the engine is running. So now let's go under the hood. Okay, so let's look at the lab scope. As you can see, our lean bus control is there. Okay. So the lean bus control is there, so the computer is definitely controlling the alternator. And then the voltage drop test on the positive side of the alternator with the engine running, we have minus 0.01 volts. So we don't have high resistance on the positive side of the alternator. Now we have a minus over here because these test leads are flipped. Okay, if I flip this around, the minus is gonna go away. Okay, watch this. Okay, so we don't have a voltage drop on the positive side of the alternator. Our lights are on, so the charging circuit is loaded. Now, if I move this alligator clamp to battery ground, if we're still connected at the alternator B positive terminal, we should read system voltage on the multimeter screen. So I'm gonna move this, so watch. As you can see, we have minus 12.15 volts. Okay, and that's just because these guys, the test leads, are kind of inversed over here. Okay, so we're good. We don't have excessive voltage drop on the positive side of the alternator. Let's do this one more time. Okay, so no voltage drop on the positive side of the alternator. A good reading is anything below 100 millivolts. So if you have a voltage drop of over 100 millivolts, you have a problem. Anything below 100 millivolts while the engine is running from positive to positive is good. Okay, so this is a good reading. We don't have excessive voltage drop on the alternator, on the positive side of the alternator, so that's good. Our control is there. So now I'm gonna turn off the engine so we can do a voltage drop test of the negative side of the alternator. So that's good. I like what I see. So we're almost done. This is starting to look like a defective alternator. As you can see, the battery light is on the dash. So this alternator is bad, guys. This alternator is defective, and that was a pretty quick one. So now I'm going to remove this alligator clamp that I have on the B positive terminal of the alternator. Okay, here it is. I'm going to remove it. Now I'm going to attach it to the bolt of the alternator. Okay, because the alternator is grounded through the case. So I'm just connecting this one on the alternator bolt. Okay, so we're good to go. So that's connected to the alternator bolt. So if we have good ground there, we should be showing system voltage on the multimeter screen. So right there. Okay, we got minus 12.42 volts. So that's good. This tells me that we are making good connection at the alternator. So now I'm gonna switch this alligator clamp from battery positive to battery negative. So this is our last test. As you can see, we're reading 0.00 volts with the engine off. So I'm gonna go in the vehicle and start the engine. You have to do this test with the engine running because we have to have current flow in the wiring of the alternator to do the test, to do a voltage drop test. Okay, so a good reading will be anything below 100 millivolts. So if we have a voltage drop of over 100 millivolts, that will be an indication of high resistance on the ground side of the alternator. So we're good so far. Okay, let's test our multimeter again. If I switch this to power, since we are connected at the alternator case, which is ground, we should show system voltage on the multimeter screen, just like that. Okay, we have system voltage there on the multimeter screen, so that's good. Okay, back to battery ground. So now I'm gonna go in the vehicle and start the engine. If we have 00 on the multimeter screen while the engine is running, that would be a good test or a good result. And then at that point, we can go ahead and condemn the alternator. So the engine is running. Let's go back under the hood. Let's see what we got. Our control is still there. We're still connected at the control wire of the alternator. Look at what we got. So we have 0.01 volts. So that's good. We're good to go, guys. We don't have excessive voltage drop on the alternator. So this issue on this vehicle is the alternator. So that's it, guys. We don't have excessive voltage drop on the negative side of the alternator. So this is good. This alternator is bad. The issue on this vehicle is a defective alternator. So there is no high resistance on the positive side of the alternator, and there is no high resistance on the negative side of the alternator. So this is good. We're done with our testing. The alternator is being controlled. It's getting power, it's getting ground. The alternator should be working right now. So we're good. Okay, no voltage drop on the ground side of the alternator. So I'm gonna turn off the engine. We're done. That's it. We are done with our testing. This alternator has to be replaced. This alternator is defective. There is no excessive voltage drop on the ground side of the alternator, and there is no excessive voltage drop on the positive side of the alternator, and the control coming from the engine computer is getting to the alternator. We saw that on the lab scope screen. So this alternator should be working right now. So the fact that it's not charging the battery, that tells me that this alternator is bad. So we are done with our testing. This alternator needs to be replaced. Okay, so I'm gonna get all my tools out of the way. So I am done. We're good to go. I'm gonna remove my back probing tool that I have over here. Okay, so we're good to go. I'm gonna get all these tools out of the way, and then I'll bring you guys back up so we can remove this alternator. Now we're gonna get the serpentine belt off of the alternator pulley. I'm gonna get my tool over here. I'm gonna try to do this one-handed. So just like that, we got the belt removed from the alternator pulley. So I got the tension off of the tensioner to get the serpentine belt removed. Okay, so the serpentine belt is off of the alternator, so that's good. So now we're gonna remove the alternator bolt. We have 2 bolts up here, and then we have 2 more bolts down here. Before I remove the alternator bolt, I am going to disconnect the electrical connector of the alternator back here. Okay, so I got the electrical connector of the alternator disconnected back here. Okay, this is the connector we were connected to when we were doing our testing. Now, this cable over here is the cable that goes to the B positive terminal of the alternator. So I can't get to the nut of it back there, it's so tight. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna follow this cable up here and then disconnect it from this point. So we're gonna disconnect it up here, because if we leave it connected at the alternator, when we take the alternator out, that stud can touch ground and then it's gonna arc. So let's remove this nut first. So we're gonna undo this nut. We're gonna carefully remove this nut. So this nut stays on the cable. That's good. This nut stays on the cable, so we're just gonna push it out of the way, just like that. So now we no longer have power going to the alternator. Now we're gonna remove the bolt for the alternator. I'm gonna start with the bottom bolts first. Now I did crack these bolts loose off camera just to speed the process. And these bolts are pretty straightforward and pretty easy to get to. Okay, so the first one is loose. Now I won't be able to remove the bottom bolts completely because they are touching the subframe down here. I'm just gonna get them loose, and then the bottom bolts will come out with the alternator. Okay, so I got the bottom bolts undone. So now we're gonna undo the top ones. So now we're gonna remove the last 2 bolts for the alternator before the alternator comes out. So I got the first bolt undone. So now I'm gonna remove the last one. So after this bolt is out, the alternator is gonna come out. Alright, so the alternator is out. I'm getting all these bolts removed. So these are the alternator bolts. I'm gonna put them out of the way. So now we can take the alternator out. So we're gonna carefully lift up the alternator. So here comes the alternator. We're gonna carefully lift it. So here is our alternator. The alternator is removed. So here's the bed unit.